Welcome to today's webinar on worm burdens in the pastoral zone. This webinar is brought to you by Making More from Sheep, Leading Sheep and Agri-Science Queensland, which is a service of the Department of Employment, Economic Development and Innovations. So today's presentation is on worm burdens. It will be delivered by Maxine Lyndal-Murphy, who's based at the Wormbuster Laboratory in Brisbane. Thanks, Maxine. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Andrea. Okay, so I've intended keeping this as quite an informal discussion. So I'm quite happy for you to jump in on some of the slides if you don't really understand anything, because the idea of this, it's fairly local, it's directed towards pastoral zones, and it's fairly important that you actually get out of this what you need to know. So please ask questions all the way through, but I've got 2 or 3 sections and we can have a little break after those. Okay, so today I thought we'd have a little look at what's happening in the pastoral zone as far as worm burdens are concerned, and that's from a laboratory perspective. We have a look at some of the signs and symptoms of worm infestations. Can you actually see them getting wormy, or can you only see them in their last throes before they die? And this brings in the point of early detection and an appropriate response. So before we get going, I thought I might draw up something for you along the lines of a worm alert, and we have these in the laboratory and we call them bench aids, and basically they're quick guides to important pieces of information that might be important to you. And as far as worms are concerned, I thought you might do a little bit about worm egg counting, where you can buy the kits, what it might mean to you, looking at the weather as indicators of when worms might get going, because you have a number of years when it's really dry and worms aren't an issue. And in fact, MLA in their 2006 report said that worms weren't an issue in the pastoral zone and there was no cost penalty involved. So we've certainly got some information for them now. And just to have a look at some of the grazing strategies so you just don't get caught off guard if you perhaps start thinking about worms and it's a little bit too late. If you've got some of these grazing strategies in place, they should help ameliorate the effect of the burdens. On the reverse side, I thought I might look at some of the drenches. There are a lot of drench activities. It's a really complex area, and I've got a colour classification that might actually help you in this process. But anyway, that's something to think about, and as we go along through the slides, think about the slides you might like to see on it, or the points you might like to see on anything like this worm alert. So a current snapshot of what we're seeing in the pastoral zone at the moment, and these results have come from lab data. So it's this year, it's 2010, and I divided it up into these 3 shires and months of the year. So this is average worm egg count with the range eggs per gram. So you can see in the Longacting Shire over this year, we had a little bit of a peak in late autumn, which is what we see, but certainly the range on some properties, egg counts are really, really high. Sheep needed to be drenched. And I guess these lower egg counts compared to the Pastoral Shire probably indicates the incidence of rainfall in that shire. Murway's had some high counts again the same time of the year, and similarly for Pastoral Shire, and this is a reflection, I think, of the rain pattern that we've... So in summary, what we've seen, just based on lab results and discussions we've had with producers, that worm infections have been sustained over a number of seasons, and we've seen winter infections, which is not really characteristic of Barbers poll, but the season was set up in autumn and those infections have carried through. The infections may not have built, but they were certainly sustained through the winter period. And most producers are really only seeing the tip of the iceberg and just treating the tip of the iceberg. And by the time they actually see those spike infections that are typical of this November to March period, they've got lots of deaths, often in weaners and those very valuable sheep. So this brings us back to early detection. So we need to do, if you keep with the iceberg analogy, a lot of work under the water level to try and negate these spike infections over the summer period. The infections certainly have downstream problems, and you need maiden ewes need to reach those target weights before they start their reproductive cycle in the following year, and certainly you want to reach the weaner target weights before you sell them. So a little bit of prediction for this summer season coming up. We would expect spike infections to occur in the next few months, particularly when temperatures are over the 25 degrees C. a little bit about Barbers pole as we go along. This is the predominant parasite in that pastoral zone area. We do see a little bit of black scale worm coming through, and most interestingly, we haven't seen any nodule worm coming through, and this is a worm you might know as pimply gut, and you often get reports back from the abattoirs that the runners have been infected. So is Barber's pole. Very characteristic of this worm is the burdens build up explosively. Given the right conditions, they're up and away, and that's warm, moist conditions. These worms lay 10,000 eggs per worm per day, so you can see that the build-up can happen really, really quickly. So Barber's pole's greatest effect is that it kills sheep. It kills them quickly because it lets blood from the abomasal wall and it feeds on blood. So Barber's pole has this little stylet in the top of its head, and it sort of lacerates the wall or the abomasal or the fourth stomach. Blood is then flowing, the parasite feeds on that, but when it stops bleeding, the gut wall has to heal itself, and it often takes 7 to 12 minutes for that to happen, so there's a lot of blood lost in the abomasal as well as through the feeding activities of the worm. The most critical thing for you guys, and where most people end up losing productivity, is because there's no early warning of these building infections. Barber's pole doesn't cause animals to lose the condition initially. They just halt that gain in weight that should be happening on a daily basis. And there's often a balance between the nutrition that the worms are taking out and the nutrition that's being eaten by the host. When the host becomes overwhelmed, nutrition is drained from it, often very quickly, and that's when you see animals succumbing. And in a worm test, we would suggest that 500 eggs per gram is a significant infection in young susceptible animals. If you had wethers, perhaps you might let that go up to about 1,000 eggs per gram, depending on the season, condition, nutrition, all those sorts of things. So how does Barber's pole build really explosively? So basically the life stages are you've got worms in the abomasal in the fourth stage of sheep, which is represented by this red circle here. These worms lay eggs in the dung, and they hatch, move out onto the grass as infective larvae, and they actually do need moisture there. And then these larvae on pasture are eaten with the graze, and the cycle continues. Now, how quickly does it happen? Once these eggs are in the dung, they can hatch within 24 hours, and in summertime, infective larvae can be on the pasture in 4 days, so that's a really quick turnaround. It means lots of sheep within the mould can be infected. And then, when there's a lot of parasites surviving on pasture and being eaten by sheep, you have this layering effect, this relentless and this really heavy reinfestation on a daily basis, and this is what leads you in spike infections. It's layer upon layer of larvae being taken in every day. And that's how Barber's pole builds up really, really quickly, and animals can succumb if there's a really heavy reinfestation rate in a number of weeks. It's not months, it's weeks. But in the pastoral zone, often your worm build-up is months after the initial infection, just because of the extensive properties that you've got sheep reared on and the contact that they have with other worms. So the signs and symptoms of Barber's pole infection: developing, building up infections, really, you're not going to see any difference in these animals. They will look really good. And I guess the mantra about Barber's pole is fantastic one day and dead the next. As a weaner, perhaps with a single infection, a heavy infection, can lose 1 kilogram in body weight over perhaps a 9-week period. But you're not really going to see that unless you're in close contact with those animals. Certainly we can all pick a mature infection. Sheep are very severely affected, and in spike infections they're very lethargic, they're anemic, so you get this swelling under the jaw called bottle jaw. They have an inability to walk 100 metres, and most typically you see deaths in weaners and in a severe outbreak in mature sheep. And these are the sorts of things producers are seeing, these really pale mucous membranes due to anemia. Young animals really lethargic, and if you happen to do a postmortem, and these pictures are courtesy of Andrea, you look in between these flaps in the abomasal or the fourth stomach, and you can see these adult worms. See this redness here? They're adult worms full of red blood. And it is suggested that you do a postmortem, and that might be something we might put on our worm alert sheet, how to do one. Okay, so the other thing you might notice if you're just observing sheep, while you might miss out on seeing build-up of the worm burden, you will certainly notice them when they've got these spike infections, but you may also notice that not all sheep in the mob will die. So the worm burden is spread across the mob. Not all sheep are equal, and the worm burdens often follow what we loosely call an 80-20 rule. 20% of the tail mob, the tail of the mob will carry 80% of the worm burden, and you often lose between 10 and 30% of animals when there's an outbreak, and that's because genetically some are far more susceptible to worm burdens. So when you do see that tail on the mob, it gives you an indication that you can actually breed for sheep that have an increased immunity to worms. The other recommendation is that you perhaps remove the tail from the mob, and you will halve the worm burden of the rest of the mob. So that may be the difference between a drench and not a drench, depending what time of the year you're doing it. And this tail then you would treat differently. You would either drench them, supplement, or give them better feed until they reach their target weights. Okay, so this sort of red line I'm trying to indicate that that's the end of the section there. So does anybody need to discuss anything about what they should or shouldn't be seeing in their sheep, and if it sparks any interest, any questions? Is that Pat?
I think Pat still had his hand up from earlier, so...
Earlier, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so will I keep moving on?
Yes, I don't think anyone's got any questions.
May as well.
Okay.
Okay, so early detection. This is where everybody wants to be, and okay. So most people do visual assessments, and then they think they need to drench. But if you cannot see a building worm burden, that's one avenue that's not going to work for you. And then we're left with really guessing or testing, and guessing is a really popular method of doing it, but I don't really think it's much better than visually looking for worm burdens. But what we would suggest, early detection, and you use both worm testing and weather indicators. And worms have quite specific requirements as to when they get going and when their cycle is broken. So if you combine those as a prompt to start worm testing, you should be on top of the issue. Okay, so back to our life stages, and just to know where we want to test and what we're actually looking for. So the ewe, represented by this, is always the contaminator of the pasture, mostly dropping eggs during a dry spell, perhaps not so many eggs. There's a suggestion that there's a hypobiosis goes on during a dry spell, that a couple of the worms just sit there really quietly. The host doesn't know about them, and they just wait there till good conditions come again, and also lambing, and then they start releasing eggs in the dung again. So this process is often continuous. Even though there's no larvae here, the reinfections may not be building, but this ewe is always, especially the pre-lambing and lambing ewe, is always seeding this pasture. So some of the tests that are available for detecting the worm test, which is a laboratory test, and we test those samples and put out these kits. There's a dipstick test, which you can actually buy and use on property, but it is for homuncus only, whereas this worm test will pick up all the roundworms of interest to you. And this test is really very good. Pharmachar, it's for homuncus only, and it's looking at anemia in the eyelids, but it's not very suitable for the pastoral zone unless you've got animals close by and you're prepared to examine each one individually. So just a little bit about the worm test. You purchase these kits from us, take the bottles out in the field and fill them up, send them back in, and we give you a worm egg count. And drenching trigger is normally about 500 eggs per gram, but there are some decisions for you to make if the egg counts are slightly higher. And a 0 egg count doesn't mean that there are no eggs there. It means that we haven't seen any eggs. So there could be a burden there. It may be very small, but if you go to this here, you can see that there are two burdens in the ewe. There's the immature burden and there's the adult burden. And there is a point in time when this adult burden is really small and there won't be eggs going into the dung. But if you've just had a large amount of rain after a dry period, this immature burden may be really, really high, and because they're not laying eggs, we can't detect it. But your dipstick will pick up the effect of both these burdens on the host, because they're letting blood, they're feeding on blood and they're letting blood, and the dipstick depends on picking up occult blood in the dung. Okay, so with this early detection, I guess when you've got a number of years and it's really dry, it's hard to know when to start again. So in the high rainfall areas, we're still fairly prescriptive. We say start at August and test every 8 weeks after that. Or maybe more convenient for you is when you've got animals that you're working with, so maybe pre-lambing, lambing, marking, weaning, and maybe midwinter if it's a particularly wet season. So we can also use these weather indicators if you want to fine-tune when we start worm testing. So certainly in this time of the year, we're looking to negating these spike infections, because this will really take productivity out of your weaners, and if it's not well controlled, you'll end up in a lot of deaths. We need these weaners to grow quickly. Often that lambing period can be a dangerous time if it's been a wet autumn, so you might want to do some worm tests there over that time. Another time when worms just knock the productivity out of animals is when it's really dry. Your worm levels are really, really low, but there's this constant pull-push sort of system with nutrition. In very dry periods, your nutrition is very low, but the worms are competing for nutrition as well. So often a low egg count won't tell you the answer there, but you can look at conditions in the paddock and decide whether you would need to drench those or not. Now, some of these weather indicators that I keep talking about, and there are a couple of typical and critical levels. So I downloaded this from the Bureau of Meteorology and from the Cunnamulla Post Office. This is just an example, but I think most of the temperatures at the pastoral zone are very similar. So night temperatures, so these are minimum temperatures here, and these are red-green. I'm sorry for those people who have trouble with red-green colours. So 10 degrees is our critical level. Below 10 degrees, we're not going to get very much worm development at all. So you can see really between May and September, there's not a lot of activity in the worm cycle out on the pasture. Once your day temperatures get to 18 degrees, and that's just about, on average, every day of the year, the worms have that possibility of developing. Once they get to 25 degrees, the cycle really starts to roll along, and the preferred temperature of Barbers pole is probably about 29 degrees. So you can see here no development in this time of the year. There may be carryover winter infections because of what was set up in this time here. So, temperature is only one factor, rainfall is the other one, but you can see, given rainfall, that you can get maximum development here at this time of the year, and this is when these spike infections start building up from here and become an issue either in November, December, or February, March. Okay, so day temperatures, just in summary, are high enough just about all of the year for some development in the cycle. The cycle is slowed by the cooler nighttime temperatures of winter, and once the temperatures get to 25 degrees, the rate of development really speeds up, and you get that layer upon layer effect when larvae are being taken in every day of the season. The other critical thing about weather is the rainfall, and classically, on average, 50 millimetres a month is what was suggested as being the trigger point for worm development. So once the daytime temperatures are right, you get this 50 millimetres of rain and off it's away. And again, this is Cunnamulla. You can see these sorts of seasons, rainfall is well above the 50 millimetres, and that's setting up the cycle. These smaller falls here are just keeping the soil moisture high. And what we're really aiming at by looking at rainfall levels is moisture around the worm pellets and around the grass, because the worm needs moisture for eggs to hatch and for larvae to develop and migrate out onto the pasture. The thing in your favour, as far as worms are concerned, I guess, knocking worms out, is the evaporation rate is fairly high for you in summer. And under some circumstances, you can get 50 mils falling one day, but blazing down sun and high evaporation rate the next day, and you often don't get good translation into larvae on pasture. So it's this sort of constant wetness, constant moisture in the grass, and you might choose to talk in terms of the greenness and the bulk of the grass rather than temperature and rainfall. But these are just indicators you need to take notice of, and they will give you early warning as to what's likely to happen in the worm cycle. So again, 50 millimetres after a dry spell is probably a trigger point, but if you've had some rain, ongoing levels of these on a daily basis of these 15 to 25 mils if your soil moisture is high. And in the higher rainfall zones, we often see if it's 5 days of showery and overcast weather, which means your evaporation rate is low, but your soil moisture content is high. And this is when we see triggering in the life cycle of the worm. And as a summary, maybe you just prefer to check the pasture greenness and content. Conversely, a hot, dry wind will certainly knock out those stages on pasture, but that's only for those few days. The ewes there, she's dropping eggs again, and the cycle will continue. So, do we want to get on to treatments now? Yep. So we've decided that our animals are wormy and they need to be treated or something needs to be done about them, and I guess there are a number of choices depending on the size of the worm egg count we'll work on. So drenching is the most usual method, and certainly in this season you will need to drench, and certainly have been drenching. The other way, which is something to think about for the future, and I don't know how many wormy seasons you've had in the last 20 years, but might be genetics and whether you need that incorporated into your breeding values if you look at that. If you choose not to use genetics, you might then follow on down from this, and we'll look at some pasture rotations that you may be able to implement just over maybe in a normal wet season over 6 to 12 weeks of the summer season. Some terminology that you might need around drenches. Drenches are often referred to as short-acting, and that's sort of straight in, straight out. Their action, they're in, kill the worms, and then sheep back in the paddock and they'll start picking up worms again. Long-acting drenches continue to act for a number of days, weeks, even up to 100 days, depending on what sort of product you're using. And in the pastoral zone where you are, you have a really good chance of these products working for you. Once you get into the higher rainfall zones, these drenches have been used ad nauseum and they no longer work. So just a warning here, if you're buying animals in from the east where they drench a lot, make sure you put in a good quarantine drench so that you're not buying in worms that are resistant to the drenches. The other bit of terminology that is often used is whether they're a single active product or a multi-active product. So there are 6 drench actives at the moment, and often they're combined to produce a multi-active product, and we'll have a look at those. With a short-acting product, I guess there's drench and move that you need to think about, but certainly with a long-acting product you would only use it in a really wet season, which is probably coming up, and then you would set stock so that this product keeps acting in the sheep for a number of days to months, and any larvae that are picked up with the greys are killed and do not establish. Okay, so would you drench? And these are based on the worm egg count, so we would draw our line in young animals in particular. You would drench if your worm egg count was higher than 500 eggs per gram. In wethers, you may actually leave it a little bit longer, 500 to 1,000 eggs per gram. But what you also have to do is to make a judgment about how big you think the immature burden is. And you would take your clues from the weather or the greenness of the grass. So you may also do a dipstick, of course, and I can run you through those protocols later if you like. But if you make the judgment that the immature burden is high and you've got weaners, you would certainly drench, you would certainly move, because weather conditions would be indicating that larval survival on pasture would be quite high. if you had wethers, for instance, at worm egg count, and you make the judgment that immature burden would be quite low, perhaps because you can see the weather drying out and the predictions are that it's going to be a dry time, you may or may not choose to drench them depending on the level of nutrition in the pasture, and you may or may not choose to move them, but perhaps stay if the weather conditions are drying out. You might perhaps keep them in that paddock if there's enough pasture there. The more problematic time is when the egg counts are in this grey area. So if you had young susceptible animals and you made the judgment that immature burden is high, you may choose to retest them in 4 weeks' time perhaps, or you just may choose to drench them and move them on. And similarly, if the burden is low, if you had wethers or less susceptible animals, you may or may not drench them. But a little bit of a trap is this zero egg count that often comes back from a lab test. And if you make the judgment, this is where you really do need to consider what the immature burden might be doing. And if you make the judgment that it is high, you may then have to take some action there with these weaners. Would you leave them in that paddock? Would you try and decide whether that immature burden is coming through, whether it might be building or whether it might be falling? But certainly in the lab we would suggest a follow-up worm test, and you might do that in 4 weeks' time and get a really strong worm egg count, or it may not be going anywhere. But certainly this is the sort of area where you need to put some consideration into what you might do. Okay, so let's now have a look at this really complex table, which is not so complex when I run you through it. So basically it's an attempt to make a colour classification of all the drenches that are on the market, and in the pastoral zone you may not see them all, but if you come closer east around these Stanthorpe areas, there's just a plethora of brand names, but there are only a few active ingredients. So on the market now there are 6, and these colours are loosely based on the colours of the single actives. The BZ, the benzimidazole drenches, are a thick whitish colour, and most of you would be familiar with those. They're the Panicas, Balvazans, Albens, and they are broad spectrum in their activity. They actually will control all of these worms that are of concern for you. The levamisole is an illworm product, and it is sort of that yellowy colour, and it's a clear, light sort of drench. The moxidectins, the macrocyclic lactones, or the mectin drenches, are a newer product on the market. They've probably been available 20 years now, or even longer, but you may be familiar with them. And there's actually a hierarchy in their development. There's ivermectin, abamectin, and moxidectin is at the top. And this potency is all about killing off worms that may be becoming resistant to these drenches. So if worms are resistant to ivermectin, an abamectin or a moxidectin will kill the ivermectin-resistant worms. But if worms have progressed through and they're resistant to moxidectin, none of the macrocyclic lactone drenches will kill these worms. So that's what that potency is. The other interesting thing about moxidectin, which is this cydectin, and it's only this one in this group, is that it's long-acting, and I think a lot of producers are actually using moxidectin in some form. And it is long-acting against Barbers pole, which is what you're looking for, and it will most likely work for you in the pastoral zone. This is the newest product on the market, and it was released in September, and its name is Zolvix, and its scientific name, its active ingredient name is monipantal, and it is actually a fluoro-orange in colour, apparently. The next one is an OP powder, napsalophos, and it is a powder, so that's how you'll know that, and it's often sold as Ramitin and Combat. It's very good against Barber's pole, and it will give you a good knockdown against black scale worm, but that's probably all you need where you are. And the last product is Closantel, and when it came out as a single active product, it was lime green in colour, lime cordial colour. And its claim to fame was it had extended action against Barber's pole worm. And it was sold as Saponver and Sustain and Closicare, and that probably will still work for you. Now, as drench resistance became a huge issue in the higher rainfall areas, the boffins decided that the way to control and get the best out of drenches was to form combinations of drenches, multi-active drenches. So I've tried to represent this here. These are this is the naphthalphos, the Ramatin powder, and there are mixing instructions with Ramatin, or you can buy mixed products. So you can mix just about everything with Ramatin, and Sidectin, which is the Moxidectin, is one that you can mix with it. But for you, in the pastoral zone, even a BZ-Lev would be a good product. And you can see that we do suggest you use a multi-active product just to overcome the development of drench resistance, or at least slow it down. This is Colleague, and this is on vet prescription, and probably very few people in the pastoral zone will use it because you've got plenty of other options. This BZ-Lev, okay, sold as Duocare or Scando. There's a lot of products. A lot of companies have brand name products for that one. This Closantel, if you're looking for a long-acting product, has the BZ in with it, so that makes it into a broad-spectrum product. Remember we said Closantel was very good against Barbers pole, and the BZ will help you if there's any black scale worm there, but also if you've got a bit of nodule worm coming through. It has action on the gut wall, which is where nodule worm tends to over-drought, and they're sold as Closal and Closicomb. These drenches down here are relatively new on the market. So you've got BZ-Lev, Abamectin is the hat trick, and Ivermectin is the Triton. So you've got 3 actives in those 3. Q-Drench has this Closantel again, which will make it into a long-acting product, although it's not registered as long-acting. It probably will be in the pastoral zone. And it's got 4 actives in, and that's often used as a good quarantine product. But if you're buying animals from further east, you're going to have issues, and you may be left with, this Zolvix product here. I think it's relatively expensive, but it's a good quarantine if you're buying from higher rainfall areas where drench resistance is rife. Another interesting product for you is, again, it's Closantel and an Abamectin to make it broad spectrum, but this Closantel is at an increased dose rate, and that was done to overcome some drench resistance in Barbers pole. But for you, have a look at this product. The idea with a multi-active product is if you've got, say, your levamisole is working really well against Barbers pole, but not at 100%, any worms that might escape that levamisole might be mopped up by one of the other actives, because the actives have different modes of action. So it's, the safety in numbers, look after your mate type sort of attitude with those drenches. The really long-acting products are sold as either injections or capsules, and a lot of producers, I think, are using this Sidectin LA, and it will act for 91 days against susceptible Barbers pole worm and 49 days against susceptible black scale worm, and that should just about do you over that weaning period if the summer season starts to be really, really wet. The thing with Sidectin, at about day 89, you need to come in with an exit drench. The drench profile of this product is when it goes into the bloodstream, you get a big hit of product there, and it's carried around in the bloodstream for the 91 days, but at decreasing levels, so it's a little bit like the slippery slope. So there is a point in time when it falls lower than the therapeutic level. So to overcome any worms that may be developing resistance at that time, it's suggested that you put in a good exit drench, and that can be something like a nilworm, and that will give you an extra 4 weeks protection. So that's, a good 3.5 to 4 months protection there. But if you're going to use these long-acting products, remember, set stock. U-Guard, Weeder-Guard, same type of thing, but shorter protection periods, shorter action periods, but they do have a 6-in-1 with them if you need to vaccinate, so that can be a useful product there. Capsules, I don't know whether you're familiar with them at all. They're a bolus product that's popped down the throat with a special gun, and the interesting thing about their blood profile is that it comes straight up. It's like a tabletop, comes straight up, stays at that level for the 100 days and then drops off. And certainly where there's a lot of drench resistance around, people put in entry drenches just to clear out what worm burden might be there. and exit drenches in case any resistant worms have come through. But theoretically, it should work for you, and the way to ensure that it does work for you is to do a worm test at day 10 after you drench. And these are just a few more capsules, depending on what sort of resistance you've got. These are multi-active one. The abamectin is the bionic, and the ivermectin is the Optimax, and they're made by different companies, but basically they're their brand name. Okay, so say you put in a short-acting oral drench, which is what most parasitologists recommend for producers these days because we're concerned about drench resistance, but pastoral zone is a special issue in this point in time. In a really wet season, sheep can actually be wormy in 4 weeks again, and under some circumstances you can be left with drenching every 4 weeks. So to avoid that, because it's a recipe for drench resistance, constant use with the one product means that you're going to select out worms that are resistant to that drench. So it's suggested that maybe you look at host genetics, and you know, that's for you to decide on your enterprise and pastoral zone and how important that would be to put in a selection criteria for you. But maybe you might be interested in starve the larvae in a really wet season. So this is something we can do with the pastures to try and make them clean and produce and improve their productivity. And perhaps this is a point for any discussion group you might have with Andrew or Alex. So why do we think we can starve the larvae? And again, this is this life cycle. And what we know here is these larvae are really susceptible to hot, dry conditions, so they're dead. A good, strong, dry wind, and most of them are dead unless they're in a really protected spot, perhaps along bore drains or other sort of hot spots where there's a bit of moisture. But infective larvae don't feed. So if it's hot and it's moist, they're really, really active, and they use up their energy reserves. In really hot, warm climates, we know about 35 days most have gone, but 35 days, yep. But 5 to 6 weeks, that's 35 to 42 days, just as a built-in little insurance. So that's what Paddock Rotation aims to do there. It aims to leave the larvae behind and starve them to death. And the suggested rotations that you see from MLA and higher rainfall areas, that you box up your weaners into one area there and divide your paddock into 4 and rotationally graze. And I'm sure most of you are aghast at the fencing that might be involved there. So Tony and I had a little discussion, and we thought maybe we could work on this and you could do something with this. If you've got your one paddock, you perhaps have a dam there, and that's where sheep come to water, and that's probably where they're picking up their infection. If you had a movable watering point, you could perhaps move that along through that paddock. And you could do it once a week. You could start off with every 2 weeks, and if you thought worms weren't well under control, you reduce your graze time, and theoretically that should increase your spell time. You just move sort of smaller areas, move them frequently. So it would be really interesting, certainly from my point of view here, if we could work on that, or if somebody's interested in thinking about that and what they might be actually able to do on property. And if you had this sort of system that you could swing into place when you were getting that wet season, and you had a sense, or there was a prediction that was going to be a wet season, this might be a good way of growing your young strop during that period. So in summary, now, my understanding that this webinar was prompted by the fact that you needed worm alert. So certainly you can test to see if the worm's built up, but you need to know when to start testing. So my suggestion is you start looking at temperatures and rainfall, or the greenness of grass. And I'll tell you a little story about the greenness of grass when I get through this. So your critical temperatures, day temperatures over 18, and that's mostly in the pastoral zone. Daytime temperatures are over 18, but the nighttime temperatures drop right down over winter, and that slows the development. And the preferred development for Barbers pole is 25 to 33 degrees. So they're really happy at that stage, and you get layer upon layer, because if it's wet, you're getting good pasture survival on larval survival on pasture. And you need this moisture for larvae to survive. So after a dry spell, certainly 50 millimetres of rain is what you were looking at. But if your soil moisture is quite high, you would then just be looking for spikes of 4 to 5 days of showery and overcast weather when your evaporation rate is low. And you should be seeing green grass if all of that is happening. So that could be an indicator to you that you need to start worm testing. The interesting situation we had around the Stanthorpe area this winter was sheep were really, really wormy, but there was hardly any grass there because the winters had been too cold for any grass growth. So here the sheep are covered in worms, but no grass, no green grass. And that was because their burdens were picked up in April, early May, and they'd continued through that winter, but the indicator of greenness of grass wasn't there. So what this producer did, he looked back over his autumn temperatures and rainfall, and he could see that perhaps the burden was only maturing a number of months later, and I think that's fairly typical of your region. If you just get the odd shower of rain in the build-up time, you won't actually see burdens coming to that drench level for a few months. So it's diligence over quite an extended period of time. So your response might be drench and move, or drench and stay, depending on the class of animal that you've got, and whether it's going to be a wet summer or a dry summer, or whether the build-up or a falling off in worm burdens. And definitely I would suggest that if you do drench, you put in this worm test at day 10, just to make sure your drench is working. When you've got these spike infections and it's critical time, you really need to know that your drench has worked pretty close to 100%, and it has worked at that level in all sheep in that mob. So that day 10 worm test is really, really important. If you choose not to drench, but you think there's worm numbers building up, you may choose not to drench perhaps in wethers, but move them onto a fresh paddock. So there are some mix and match options here. So you base that on the indicators, and that will tell you that, enable you to make judgments about the size of the immature worm burden, and as opposed to test results for the mature burden, or you can put in your dipstick. And a couple of points to consider, and I've sort of covered them. For the future is that rotation system, perhaps for weaners. And I think most producers actually prepare those lambing paddocks, but you might want to test pre-lambing and see if you need to put a drench in over that lambing period over 8 weeks if you've had a particularly wet autumn.
Pat, do you have a question?
Yes, Andrea, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, Maxine, any sign of live Barbers pole in the abomasum of a sheep, is that an indication that there's a bit to worry about or not? It may not. I just killed 4 sheep the other day for rations, some wethers and some big wethers, and each one I checked, and they did have a few Barbers pole in that abomasum swimming around, not huge numbers. But is that an indication, or do you still need to test, do you think?
Oh, I think it certainly indicates to you that the worm cycle's going. It's fairly hard to make a judgment about really small numbers. So I guess you need to. I mean, the easiest answer is if you do a worm test. But these are wethers. Are they on a good plane of nutrition?
Yeah, excellent at the moment, because we've had really good rain in the last month, so
rain.
That's starting to wind them up.
Well, you know, so if you make a judgment that there's just a few numbers there and they may be building, and you would suggest maybe that the immature burden is fairly high, so you might choose to move them on to another paddock, but you know, you can put a drench in there.
So do you think it'll be too early?
It will be subjective in the. Do I think it's too early?
I was just wondering whether you thought it was a bit early, perhaps, to put a long-acting drench in there, because they'd be starting to build now, wouldn't they? I would think. Is it better to wait a bit longer?
Oh, November. What's your daytime temperatures up to?
35.
Oh, well, yeah, they're having a great time, I'd say.
Yep, so there's potential there to be a pretty major problem.
Yeah, are you in Paru?
No, I'm at Longreach.
Okay. So you've got a good season, temperatures are high, but some of the nighttime temperatures are still fairly low, aren't they?
Yeah, sort of.
Look, I think at this time of the I think at this time of the year, look, your November drench really is a critical one. Yeah, I would be inclined to drench them and move them, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, did you have something else, Pat?
Yeah, I just wondered, would you recommend then a quick-acting or a long-acting drench, Maxine? In that instance, would you give them a quick-acting and another one in a couple of months' time, in around January, February, or spend money on a long-acting one now and hope that...
Have you got any other... Yeah, have you got any other class of stock on the property? Are you just a wethers, are you?
No, we got ewes and lambs, quite a lot of ewes and lambs, which are about to mark in a week's time, and then we run quite a few wethers. So we've got 3,000 breeders and about the same number of lambs.
Yeah. So sort of rule of thumb as far as drench resistance is concerned, and at this time of the year you just don't want to lose productivity, so you need to put in really good drenches. If you go long-acting, you probably should keep them in the paddock that they're in.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it's a number of paddocks. If you're going to put a short-acting in, I'd definitely drench and move them.
Yeah.
But maybe you keep your long-acting for your lambs and your ewes and weaners, or you're close to weaning, are you?
Yes, I'm going to mark and wean in one hit in 10 days' time.
Yeah.
It's got beautiful feed.
And the mix and match is because you would hope that some of those wethers would have some innate resistance. You've got Dorpers or Merinos?
All Merinos.
Merinos, yeah. They should have some resistance, but as you know, if it's a really wet season, I think I'd be inclined to give them long-acting. The prediction is for a wet summer, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes, yep.
Yes, yeah, and you've got plenty of feed. Yeah.
Got beautiful feed. We've had nearly 6 inches of rain since the end of September, so there's just magnificent feed, and it's really green at the moment, so everything's sort of spot on for a bad worm problem, I think.
And the other issue is when you've got young animals, it appears that they're not happy to go through the long grass, and they tend to congregate, and they get really high worm burdens because they've got local overcrowding, and they get a little bit of coccidia as well. So sometimes it's sort of necessary to, producers tell me, to put bigger animals through first that might knock down some of the grass. I don't know whether you've seen that sort of issue at all.
Yeah, no, that's correct. They do tend to use the shorter areas, there's no doubt about that.
And they'll get wormy really, really quickly. Yeah. Sorry. You've got cattle, have you?
No, you run a lot of adjustment cattle. I don't own any cattle, but I run a lot of adjustment cattle, and I use them for that purpose to basically chew the grass down a bit.
Yep.
As well as cash flow, obviously, but...
Oh, yeah, we're only talking worms here. Yeah. No, that's excellent.
Excellent. Well, we've got some questions from Ninian. He doesn't seem to be working, but he's got 2 questions. When using long-acting drenches, why do you say to set stock?
Okay, and it's about drench resistance, and one of the characteristics of a long-acting drench is will actually help you clean the paddock. So, the sheep have got this on board. Say you put in say you put in a capsule, and it's going to work for 100 days, close to 3 months. So you keep the sheep in there, and that product is working, and every time the animal eats some grass, it's picking up larvae most likely because it's a good worm season, and those larvae will be killed and won't be able to establish in the sheep as long as that drench is on board. So with the long-acting products, you do need to set stock so that you can take advantage of the long action.
Okay. And the second question is, can I put drenched sheep into a paddock that has had cattle in recently and get the desired result?
Definitely, yep. Parasitologists like adult cattle grazing paddocks first, yep. The theory is that cattle are a hostile host to sheepworms. Barbers' pole from sheep will go into cattle, not adult cattle, but young cattle, to a very limited extent. So we do say adult cattle. And if you've got young cattle, I guess, and it's really wet, they can get their own worms as well. So, yeah, that's fine. The idea is that cattle graze down the grass, open it up a bit, and if it's really hot, although I think you've had far too much rain for any drying out effect to happen. But that's the theory, that the cattle will open up the pasture, larvae will die because the heat gets in, and then it's fine for sheep. So if you can sort of spell and graze for cattle for up to about 6 weeks, you should be doing very well, providing a low worm paddock.
Next question from John Hardy. John,
yes,
are you still there?
Yes. This may not be relevant at the moment, but when we're feeding out cottonseed and other seeds on the ground, is that a recipe for picking up worms? I thought not. I thought it would have been on grass, but I just want to clarify that.
So that's on bare ground?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, let's think about it. So eggs in dung dropped onto the ground. So eggs will hatch because it's nice and warm and moist, and larvae will move out of the dung pellets. I'm just laughing here. I'm just thinking something else I can help you do. What we do when we collect infective larvae, and they're really, really tiny, but you can see them as a white cloud, a whole mass of them, we actually store them in water. So then they're not going to drown. That's the way they live. If you've got a whole lot of dung in that situation, you might like to put it in a bottle and just rest the lid lightly on top so there's a good airflow. And by about day 6, if there's a lot of eggs in that dung, they should have hatched into larvae, and the larvae will come roaring out of those dung pellets and crawl up the side of the container, and you will see tracks of millions of larvae. So they are dropping, so it depends how dry it is and whether they're actually able to pick up those larvae. So while there's not grass there, it's not only grass that provides that moisture for them. If the ground is wet and there are little puddle holes, it is possible. To what extent, I'm not really sure. But yes, larvae will survive in little puddles. If you had 6 inches of rain, it sounds to me like there might be some puddles around.
Thank you.
Excellent. And another question from Pat.
Yes, Andrew, thank you. Maxine, if you don't mind, could you just run us past the more common long-acting drenches again that are most effective for this area?
Okay.
Please.
Okay. Well, you have the advantage that probably most drenches will work pretty well, unless you've actually tested for drench resistance.
Right.
Okay. Long-acting drenches, okay. So we'll go back to these single-active ones. So there are only 2. Anything that has chrysanthil in it, or anything that has moxidectin in it. So that's a Shortacting product, or these Saponvar, Sustain, Clozicare. So you just want to have it as long-acting against Barbers pole?
Preferably, yes.
Okay, so...
That'd be our main problem here, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And if you did that, I'd come in autumn with something with maybe a BZ in it, just in case that nodule worm gets going and black scour gets going. But you can buy chrysanthil as a standalone product. And moxidectin is broad spectrum. And you can buy that, but I think maybe chrysanthil might be a cheaper product. But it will give you longer action if it's still working, so it'll give you, 4 to 6 weeks. Shortactin's a bit less than that, 30 days pasture protection, so this is probably 6 weeks pasture protection.
So the chrysanthil...
But if you wanted to buy it in... Yeah, well, there's only 2 ingredients that are long-acting. So, this is here, Closel, Clozicome. There are other brand names. That's it combined with the BZ, the Panicobarbazan type products. And, you've then got the option of these 2, sort of the Q drench with the 4 actives, or the Genesis Extra, which is the increased dose rate of chrysanthil plus the abamectin. And
thank you.
And, the abamectin... You right?
Yes, thanks.
Excellent. Was there any other questions?
Oh, do you want to actually have a look at these capsules or injections? Are you interested in that, Pat?
Well, I just thought maybe if we're marking lambs with that Shortacting LA would be an option for young lambs.
Yeah.
Or the weaner guard. Because we normally...
if you want a 6...
See, we normally vaccinate everything anyway with a 6-in-1 at lamb marking and weaning. I just wondered whether that maybe that weaner guard would be a better option than a 6-in-1 at lamb marking.
Yep, they've certainly got the 6-in-1. Yeah, so that's we've got the long-acting, and in fact this Sidectin here as an injection is longer acting than the oral product by about 7 days.
Okay.
It's not right. That's 30 days past the protection. Should be.
But that Sidectin LA is going to give you a lot longer protection, isn't it? 91 days or something.
It does, but it doesn't have the 6-in-1. But that could very well take you through November, December. Yep. Might be late January, February before you might need to do something about it again.
Then you might just need to use an exit drench, nilworm or something. You said.
Yep. Or you can do a BZ Lev combo, like a Duocare or Scandar there, and just to protect that nilworm. But just an exit drench after that, and you should actually you're getting into autumn at that stage.
Thank you very much.
Melissa, you've got a question?
Maxine, I was just wondering where you get those dipsticks from and that other guide you had there.
Okay. I think, here we are. This is what we're talking about in case people are interested. All right, so you buy this little kit. Anne Care commercialised it, but I think Anne Care and Merial have interest in each other, and I think Merial are also distributing it as well. So Anne Care works through CRT resellers, and Merial, I think, works through Elders. So you buy this kit, and you can buy these replacement things here. And most people say to me, we can get this all off the internet, but be very careful. If you want these replacement vials, they need to be boil resistant, otherwise they leak and will ruin your test. And just out of interest, if you're interested, there are quite a few little steps. You have to make a couple of dilutions. And your rice cooker is in there because you do a little bit of a boil here, and then you cool it, and then your actual dipstick testing is in and out for exactly 3 seconds, and then you sort of look at the colour change. So when you get up to this 3, which is green, there's occult blood in the dung, and you know that you need to drench. So I think they were marketing them about $160 roundabout, but certainly go to I think CRT or Elders, and they will actually run you through the test and show you how to do it. And if you can't find a local one, either give us a call or you can ring Anne Care. Andrew, you might like to, if producers have a query, I can give you contact in Anne Care and they can organise something for your producers.
Okay. Pat's got another question.
Yeah, Maxine, I just wondered, those test kits, are they, do you consider them pretty accurate as compared to the egg counts that you would do in the lab?
This dipstick?
Yes.
Yeah. I guess they're telling you two different things. The dipstick is looking at occult blood, unusual blood in the feces, and that's indicating that Barbers pole worms are feeding, because they feed on blood, but they also let blood that is wasted down the gut. So it will tell you what the immature burden's doing, and for me, dipstick is really, really good early in the season after you've had a dry period, you had a bit of rain, conditions are looking fairly good, but you can still get a really low worm egg count, a 0 or a low worm egg count, and at that stage, a dipstick might be the way to go. And in fact, it just occurs to me that maybe that's a service we could offer. We could actually do a dipstick at that point in time. You could possibly indicate on your submission form that you're concerned about an immature burden, and we might actually take that on board and do that. But it's something I can think about. But certainly that's where I would use a dipstick test, I think, to pick up that immature burden. Once the season is in full swing, you've got a fair idea of what's happening, and you can just keep up with your egg counting because your immature burden's coming through. I mean, coming through and maturing into egg laying, yeah.
Yep. Thank you.
so that's okay. Genevieve, you've got a question?
Would you just remind me about, like, the time from immature to mature?
Okay, so that period in the host of Bomson is set. So from when larvae are taken in to eggs in the dung is 21 days. Whoops, have we got it there? Okay, so there's 21 days. That is always 21 days. So, for instance, if you had a clean paddock and you didn't want it contaminated, but you could box up your wethers, give them a good drench and they're clean, but you wanted to knock that paddock down but didn't want to make it wormy for something else, you could put those wethers in there for 19 days, take them out day 19, and no eggs would go back onto the pasture. Okay, and in the meantime, they could be picking up worm larvae from the pasture. So that's a way of cleaning a paddock, perhaps for lambing or for the weaners. But that is 21 days, that's set. When it gets a bit cooler, it could be a little bit longer. When it gets a bit hotter, maybe down to about 19 days. We haven't really seen that, but you will read in the literature that they can come through from about day 14. But in all the work we've done, we never see that.
In to eggland.
That's from when larvae go in to their eggs in the dung. So that's all of this here. It's 21 days, always, never varies.
And eggs in the dung start dying after 5 days, did you say?
If weather conditions are hostile, they will die. That day's lot will die. So the next lots drop the next day, conditions are still hostile, they'll die. And that goes on and on and on until conditions turn around, and then they'll progress through to the larval stage.
I just had a comment here from Ninian. He used a dipstick test over the last 2 weeks on his weaners, and it showed a high level of infestation on 2 occasions, so he guessed that he needed a drench, and he drenched him yesterday with Remiton. So. Oh,
okay, yep. So that's a good Barbers pole product. It's not long-acting, but it'll also give him a good knockdown of black scour. But those OPs have no action lower down in the gut, so it certainly won't get nodule worm, but we haven't seen any of it in the last few seasons. I think the last time I saw a good case of nodule worm was in about 2002, and I would have thought it had the opportunity of coming back, but so far we haven't seen it through the lab.